Good morning. This is Bruce Bolger. I'm founder of the Enterprise Engagement Alliance, one of the leading organizations advocating for a stakeholder approach to management. And this is part of our annual education program on specifically stakeholder management. We're very pleased to have Professor Alex Edmans of the London Business School, who's author of Grow the Pie. And it's really one of the seminal works in terms of demonstrating that you can deliver both purpose and profit. So I'm going to, without any further need for introduction, introduce Alex. This is going to be his show, so sit back, and I thank you all for joining. Alex, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Bruce, and thank you in particular for your support of my work from the outset. So I think it was probably over a decade ago that we first interacted with each other, and it's a huge honor for this book to be part of the curriculum. So what I'm going to talk about today is the financial and business case for responsible business. So Wes, we do have the ethical and moral case, and morals and ethics are certainly important. But I think unless there's a strong business and financial case, purpose will always be secondary in any organization. And so my background is finance. So I am a professor of finance, not business ethics or philosophy. My past job was an investment banker at Morgan Stanley, both in London and New York. But why, despite having a pure finance background, I can be so positive about responsible business is that there's a financial and business case, not just a moral and ethical one. So much of today will be on how to put purpose into practice, but I will start by explaining, well, what I mean for purpose to mean about purpose to begin with, because I think we need to understand what we're talking about before we think about how to implement it. And so let me start with a case study. So if we go back to 2003, the UK telecoms company Vodaphone noticed that Kenyan citizens were using their mobile phones to transfer mobile minutes to each other as a form of currency. And this gave them an idea. And they thought, what if we could develop a technology that would allow people to transfer not mobile minutes, but actual money? At the time, 15 million Kenyan adults were unbanked. They had to rely on cash, which could be forged or lost or stolen. So if they could pull this off, the social impact would be huge. And indeed, 4 years later, Vodafone developed M-Pesa, a mobile money service in Kenya. And so what is mobile money? We often think it's mobile banking. I still have a Bank of America account from my days in the US, and I can operate that on my phone. That's really convenient because I'm now based in the UK. But that is not what mobile money is about. With mobile money, you don't even need a bank account to begin with. And that was really powerful, given that so many Kenyan citizens were unbanked. And so this completely transformed many people's lives. In the first 7 years, studies show that it lifted 200,000 households out of poverty. And many of these households are headed up by women. They allowed them to move from agriculture to business and retail, so there was a large effect on gender equality. So why am I starting my talk with this story? It's to ask these two questions. The first is, how much value did M-Pesa create for society? And the second is, if Vodafone did not launch M-Pesa, what would have been the public outrage or damage to Vodafone's ESG rating? So the first question, how much value did it create? A huge amount of value, lifting hundreds of thousands of households out of poverty and contributing to gender parity. But in terms of the second question, what would have happened if Vodafone did not launch M-Pesa? Nothing. There would have been no negative effect on its reputation. There would have been no customer boycott because nobody would have thought it was even possible to come up with this crazy idea of banking without a bank. There would have been no media headlines and so on. And so this is why what I'm talking about today is not ESG. It's about social purpose and responsibility. So what is the difference, right? We often see these things as being used synonymously. But ESG is often viewed as the answer to that second question. It's about businesses doing no harm. We should not cheat on tax. We should not pollute the environment. We should not mistreat our workers. And please don't get me wrong, part of purpose is doing no harm. But I would argue that that is not enough. Companies need to answer the first question and actively do good, even if it's something that was not necessary to avoid a media scandal. So why is that my view of purpose? Well, first, you can have moral and ethical arguments, which is given all the challenges that the world faces today, it is not enough for a company to just to say, I'm not exacerbating those challenges. Instead, companies need to contribute towards solving those problems, not just not making them worse. But that was a moral and ethical argument. I started my talk by saying I'm going to focus on the business and financial case. And what is the business and financial case of answering that second question? It's about good risk management. Like, we don't want to be investing in a company that ends up being in a scandal. But if your goal is only risk management, then you would only pursue ESG to the minimum threshold required to avoid a scandal. There's no need to prioritize it above that minimum level. Let's just make sure that we do enough to avoid getting in the newspaper. But if we instead think about purpose as answering that first question, then that is something that we actively and positively want to embed in our business. And so what is the financial case for answering that first question? If we are creating value for society, then people will ultimately be willing to pay for that. And ultimately, we will be able to turn that into a profit. So when Vodaphone launched M-Pesa, they genuinely did that to create value for society, not to make money. But ultimately, they were able to monetize it and turn it into a revenue stream. And so this is the key framework that I've introduced when we think about responsibility, which is cast in my book called Grow the Pie. So what is the pie? Well, the pie is the value that a company creates. And that pie can be split between investors in the form of profits, that's the blue, and society in terms of value, that's the orange. That could be fair taxes, fair wages, fair prices. And we often think that a purposeful company is one that splits the pie more fairly. So it might donate some profits to charities, it might pay workers more than it needs to, it might charge lower prices than it can get away with. And again, don't get me wrong, like, part of purpose is fairness and equality. But what I'm saying is companies need to do more than just that. Why must purpose be more than just about a redivision of a fixed pie? For two reasons. First, if purpose means moving from here to here, then very few CEOs will truly want to embrace it. Why would I want to do something that makes my company less profitable? And indeed, in 2019, we saw 181 CEOs in the US sign this business roundtable statement, claiming they're going to serve wider society, but it's not clear that all of them have put it into practice. And you might think, well, why would they? If indeed purpose means we're going to be less profitable, then let's just sign some nice statements but never genuinely pursue it. And the second reason why purpose can't just be about redistribution is that it's bad for investors. Now, many people think, I don't care. They like to portray investors as nameless, faceless capitalists. Investors are them, society is us, and if we can take from them and give to us, then the world is better off. But investors are not them. They are us. They include parents saving for their children's education, pension funds investing for retirement, and insurance companies funding future claims. So any repurposing of business absolutely needs to take profit seriously. Investors play a key role in a well-functioning society. So this is why my view of what purpose involves is it's about growing the pie. Yes, we absolutely do want to increase the orange, but the way we do that is not by giving a greater slice of what's already there, but through innovation, through excellence, through coming up with some crazy and bold and courageous ideas like banking World Bank. Because the beauty of that is, even if we pursue these innovations to create value for society, ultimately we will be able to monetize that and then turn that into a profit. So at this point in my talk, you might think, well, everything Alex says sounds great, but it seems almost too good to be true. Well, I'm saying if companies think about serving society, then magically some profits will appear. But that seems like wishful thinking. Where is the evidence? Well, I've given you one example of one company where purpose did lead to profit. But how do you know that I didn't just handpick this one case because it supports my story? Maybe in most other companies, purpose is a distraction from profits and eats into the bottom line. So this is why my day job as a business school professor is not to tell stories. It's not even to write case studies, but to study hundreds of companies across dozens of industries over multiple years and to ask, is it the case that purposeful companies actually perform better? So one of the questions is, well, how do we measure purpose? You might think, well, can we just look at a company's purpose statement? But companies might say some nice things and not actually deliver. So then you might think, well, do companies put their money where their mouth is? How much do they give to charity? How much do they spend on their workers? But measuring the spending tells you nothing about the quality of that expenditure. For example, it could well be that you donate lots to charity, but you're not giving to the right charities. And it could be you're doing many great things for your workers that don't cost you money. So to provide meaningful work and skills development and mentorship and empowerment and delegation, that doesn't cost a boss anything, but can have a huge effect on her employees. So what I chose to look at was the output, how much value you create, not how much you spend. And so what I looked at was the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America. Those are companies that go above and beyond in how they deal with their employees. Now you might think, well, why do I look at employees? Isn't climate the main purposeful issue that people care about? And absolutely, climate change is really, really important. But climate change matters more for some industries, let's say energy, than others, let's say tech. So why I focus on employees as they matter for nearly every organization. And also I had a very good data source. So why did I look at this data set? Two reasons. First is this measures actively doing good, not just doing no harm. There are other measures of things like labor unrest and strikes and injuries. But as I said, purpose is not just about avoiding those negative outcomes. It's going above and beyond and creating a healthy and enriching workplace with credibility, respect, fairness, pride, and camaraderie. And this looks at companies that are in the 100 best. The second reason why I look at this is that this data source was around since 1984. So ESG is a pretty new phenomenon. And so many data sources might have only been around for 10 or 15 years. And if I showed you a study where ESG pays off between 2010 and 2019, you might say, well, those were 10 great years for the stock market. Maybe right now, when we're concerned about inflation and the recession, we should just focus on profit and not care about things like stakeholder value. But because my data started in 1984, I had things like the financial crisis and September the 11th and the collapse of the internet bubble, so I could make sure that this was something that held in bad times as well as good. So, long story short, what did I find? I found that the 100 best companies to work for in America delivered shareholder returns that beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period, which is 89 to 184% cumulative. And if we step back from the numbers, what does this mean? Well, companies that treat their workers well, they're not just being moral and ethical, they're making a sound business and financial decision. They're investing in their most important asset. They're not just giving pie to their workers, they're growing the pie, and workers are becoming more productive and more motivated. Now, you might be skeptical, because is this correlation or is this causation? I seem to be suggesting if you treat your workers well, it grows the pie and shareholders are better off. But could it be reverse causality? Once a company is already doing well, it can start spending money on its work. Or maybe there are third factors that affect both. If you're in the tech industry, workers are happy because the job is more pleasant than in, say, coal mining. And also in the tech industry has done really well, again, because its prospects are much better than coal mining. So a lot of the work I have to do is to address those alternative explanations and suggest that it's employee satisfaction that leads to financial performance rather than the other directional relationships. But even if you believe that I've nailed down the direction of the relationship, you might ask, has this got anything to do with purpose? Could this just be about profits? Like any CEO with a long-term mindset might know, if I treat my workers better, they'll be more productive and I'm going to make more money. So do you need CEOs to think about purpose to get them to invest in their employees? Even if they only cared about money, any sensible CEO will know that I want to motivate my employees so they'll help me make more money. Indeed, you might think about, why do companies now invest in electric cars? Well, what a finance professor like me would say is do a calculation. I can estimate how many cars will I produce, how much I can sell them for, and if the benefits exceed the costs, I can go ahead. Importantly, I don't need to care about climate change. I only need to care about money. And as long as I care about money, I'm going to build that electric car factory because there's money to be made. But the limitation of this is not every decision can be reduced to a financial calculation. I acknowledge that you could build a spreadsheet for the electric car factory, but if we go back to the Vodaphone M-Pesa decision, that could have never been justified with a spreadsheet. Like, the tech challenges were huge, it would probably never work, and even if it did work, there was no money to be made by serving some of the poorest people in the world. But the power of the pie growing mindset is it frees us from having to take every decision based on a financial calculation. Instead, the motivation is to build a better world. And this spurs us to create, to discover, to explore, to come up with some crazy ideas like banking without a bank that ultimately end up being successful, but we could have never predicted the success from the outset because it's really hard to predict more than a few years out, and because profits often come from sources that you least expected. So what is the evidence that profits might be unexpected? Well, strategy professor Caroline Flammer, she looked at shareholder proposals to make a company more responsible. So this is when shareholders go to an annual general meeting and suggest that companies reduce their carbon emissions or implement an anti-discrimination policy. And what she found was that after these proposals are passed, sales go up, the stock price goes up, and profits go up. So even though these proposals aimed to create value for society, not to make money, they grew the pie and ultimately profits went up anyway. But here's the most interesting thing. Those proposals should not be needed if the profit mindset were enough. Like, any CEO should know that anti-discrimination is good for my profits, so they should have implemented the anti-discrimination policy anyway, just because it's the way to make money. But they didn't. So it took the perspectives of outside investors with an explicit social objective to open their eyes to the possibility that things done for societal and social reasons might ultimately lead to profits down the line. So the bulk of my talk is to put this into practice, but I think it was important to highlight, what are we putting into practice? Growing the pie, creating value, not just doing that. So what is my first tip to think about putting purpose into practice? It's actually not to think about purpose to begin with, but to think about excellence. Because for most organizations, simply being excellent at what you do has a major impact in society. So now that ESG is so popular, you have a rush of companies trying to demonstrate that they're doing ESG. How much they give to charity, how much they cut their water usage, how much they allow in terms of employee volunteering. And those are good things. But I think for most companies, the biggest thing you can do for society is just to be excellent at your core business. I've done some work with Network Rail. They run the train tracks in the UK. And they think about, can we reduce graffiti at our stations? Yeah, that matters. But just getting the trains to run on time because of a well-maintained track, that has a huge effect on society. It means that people can live, get to work. It means that they can live in the country and work in the city and so forth. So that core business is key. And for me, as a professor, what is the best way that I contribute towards society? Yes, I do bike to my lectures. I don't drive. But that has much less of an impact than me trying to make sure that my lectures are well prepared, that they're both practical and rigorous and interesting and relevant to the real world. And again, for me, that is the core business, not so much how I choose to get to my lectures. And so you might think, well, shouldn't every business try to be excellent? Do you need a purpose to know excellence? Even if a business was focused on profit, it might strive to be excellent. But that's actually not the case, because a profit-focused business would only be excellent in things that it has a clear link to profit. Other things, which might be hidden, you might shirk on. For example, if you're a restaurant, you might shirk on cleanliness of the kitchen because that's not something that people see. And certainly as a professor, you are given promotion and tenure exclusively based on research. Nobody cares about teaching. But if you're a purposeful professor, what is the purpose of a finance professor? It's the creation and dissemination of knowledge. And therefore, I will care about my teaching because I think this is the right thing to do. And similarly, Vodaphone put as much effort into launching M-Pesa and making sure that it was excellent as it might do for its revenue generating activity, because that was something consistent with serving society. So now let me get on to purpose, which is a phrase I've mentioned many times, but not formally defined. And just like I have a different view on ESG, I will also have a different view of what purpose is about. So many companies believe that purpose is about altruism. And they will say, if it's about altruism, let's be as generous and serve as many constituencies as possible. They might have purpose statements which are a bit like this. Our purpose is to serve customers, workers, suppliers, the environment, and communities and investors. That sounds fantastic. But it's unrealistic because in reality, there are trade-offs. You cannot serve everybody. If you are an energy company and you close down a polluting plant, that's good for the environment, but it's bad for work. So a statement like this sounds great, we're serving everybody, but it's meaningless and it's unrealistic because there will be trade-offs in the real. And if you think about the word purpose in the English language, it doesn't mean altruism. Purpose is about being focused and having direction. So if I do something on purpose, I'm doing it deliberately. And if I hold a purposeful meeting, that's one with a clear agenda. So I define purpose as why a company exists, who it serves, its reason for being, and the role that it plays in the world. And now that might sound a bit lofty and idealistic. So let me pick it apart. So first, purpose is about service. A purpose cannot be to make profits. Right? Profits are important, but profits are a byproduct of serving society. They're not the end goal. So Vodaphone's purpose was to build a digital society that enhances socio-economic progress. And if they do that, they will ultimately be financially successful. The second thing to highlight is that purpose is focus, as I mentioned earlier. Why you exist, who you serve, your reason for being, and the role that you play, they all have to be targeted. So often people think a purposeful company should try to contribute to all 17 sustainable development goals. And the more you take off, the better. But it is not a company's responsibility to solve every single one of the world's problems, but to focus on the 3 or 4 where it can really move the needle. And so how does a company decide what to focus on? By asking yourself, what is in your hand. So what I mean by this is, what are the resources and what is the expertise that my company has, and how can I use these resources and that expertise to serve society if I could think a little bit more creatively? So Vodaphone's expertise was in transferring text messages, and they used that technology to instead transfer money, and that's why they chose to focus on financial inclusion rather than one of the world's many other challenges. And I think the idea of thinking about purpose as using what's in your hand is particularly powerful because it works in difficult times as well as good times. So often people think, well, you can only do purpose when companies are flush with cash and there's a lot of money that we can donate. But donating money, I don't think is necessarily purposeful. Yes, if you donate to charity, this gives you great public relations. But if you're a telecoms company, your expertise is telephone services. You don't know whether the American Cancer Society is a better charity than something which looks at animal rights or something that looks at racial diversity. And so when we think about the coronavirus crisis, there were many companies that did purposeful actions that involved splitting the pie more fair. CEOs took pay cuts, they paid workers who were furloughed, and Unilever gave 100 million euros of food and sanitizer to local communities. Now, those are fantastic examples, and companies that do that, they should indeed be praised. But those are examples of splitting the pie differently. And that was only possible for companies that had pie to give to begin with. And that was not true for many other companies who were really hit by the pandemic and didn't have pie that they could donate. So this is why I'm trying to highlight what does it mean to be purposeful. It's about growing the pie and using what is in your hand. So this allows companies in even unrelated industries to help out. So yes, Unilever was related. It had made food and sanitizer. That was its core business. But what about Mercedes? So Mercedes, particularly Mercedes powertrain, they make Formula One engines. Now, Formula One is completely useless in a pandemic. But what was in their hand is precision engineering expertise. And that same precision that you need to make a Formula One engine, you also need to make ventilators. And so what they did was they reverse engineered an off-patent ventilator and then mass produced it at scale. What about small companies? Because we often think that unless you are a massive company, you don't have the resources to engage in purpose. As a smaller company, let's just think about survival. But let me give you an example of a small company that I am a customer of. It's called Barry's Bootcamp. So this is a chain of gyms in London. There are also gyms in the US as part of this franchise. Now, what did they do in the pandemic? They didn't have tons of money to donate. So what they did was they offered free Instagram fitness classes, which made a huge difference because people were self-isolating at home. Now you might think, well, that is not a great example because you don't need to be a special company with a special purpose to think about offering free fitness classes. If you're a fitness company, that is kind of obvious. But here's the really special part, is what happened with the desk staff. So these are the people who work at reception when you go in and they give you a towel. So because the gyms were closed, there was nothing that they could clearly do. However, what it turns out is that many of these desk workers are actors in their main job. And if you're an actor, because your income is quite volatile, what they did is they took this side job at Barry's to provide some income stability. And if you're an actor, what is in your hands? Well, you're really funny. But how does that help out? Well, what we had was that in the crisis, we had many parents' children were at home because the schools were shut. And so what they offered was free Zoom storytelling sessions, which made a huge difference while people were self-isolating at home. So again, what this suggests is that if what we can do is to think about serving wider society, then that's something that we can do even if we're in difficult times, and even if we are a small company without a lot of money to donate. So what I've talked about so far is the idea of comparative advantage. Let's focus on the issues on which we have expertise. But that was the why. Why do you exist? What problems you're going to try and solve? Those are the ones in which you have comparative advantage. But I also had in my definition of purpose, who will you serve? And so what this is the idea of materiality. So what this says is, yes, there's loads of different stakeholder constituencies, and we would love to serve all of them, but actually we can't. So what we need to do is to focus on the couple of ones which will really move the needle, which have the biggest effect on the company's business. For example, if you are in a plastics industry, then suppliers don't really matter because what you're buying is petrochemicals, and so that might not be so important for you. They're pretty generic. But if you're in, say, farming, then sustainable farming is really important for an agribusiness like Olam, and so they'll invest a lot in sustainable farming because that's a material issue. And so why is it important to use these principles? Because this makes sure that any purpose that you pursue is consistent with profit. So if you are thinking about comparative advantage, then what you are doing to serve society, you create a huge bang for buck. A small investment can lead to lots of outcomes because you are using your expertise. And on the flip side, if you are contributing towards material stakeholders, then that's something which will then end up boosting the business and benefiting shareholders because those are stakeholders that are material to your business. So let me drill down a little more about purpose. So I've said it needs to be focused, and I've given you guidance on what to focus on, issues on which you have comparative advantage and that are material to your business. But let me go a level deeper and say a purpose should be controversial and should be uncomfortable. So why? What I'm claiming here is that a purpose is only meaningful if the opposite would also be reasonable. So what do I mean by this? So if I was to start this talk by saying, I'm going to give you a good talk, that would have been meaningless because nobody would have started to talk by saying, I'm going to give a bad talk. But if it said, I'm going to start my talk by saying, I'm not just going to focus on the ethical and moral case, but the business and financial case, that is meaningful because there could be others who give a talk just based on morals and ethics. So a statement only means something if it tells you something new and if it rules you something out. So what I ruled out was me giving a talk purely on the moral and ethical and ideological case. And that ruling that out is informative because it would have been completely reasonable to have had a purely ideological talk. And so this is why I view a purpose of saying we're going to serve everybody as being meaningless, because no company would say our purpose is to destroy value for customers and workers. Whereas Costco's purpose is meaningful because it says we're going to produce quality goods and services at the lowest possible price. And so this says that price is more important to us than quality. And so why is that something which is reasonable? Because the opposite could also be reasonable. Rolls-Royce says we actually prioritize quality over price. So Costco's saying we prioritize price over quality. That is reasonable because that rules out something. This tells me what the company stands for. And we can also take the same approach to a company's attitude towards individual stakeholders. So let's go back to employees. Now, there are some companies which say our goal is to provide rewarding work. That is bland. That is meaningless. Why? Because this doesn't tell you anything about, well, what are the rewards? So are they going to give financial rewards? Are they going to give social, psychological rewards by providing meaningful work? It tells you nothing. No company is going to come out and say, we're going to provide non-rewarding work. This tells you nothing. But if we instead look at Netflix's attitude towards workers, that is interesting because it's a bit uncomfortable. Right, so they say Yes, we care about the things everybody else cares about, integrity, respect, but what we particularly prioritize, which is unique, is how much we are extraordinarily candid with each other and keep only our highly effective people and avoid rules. And that's meaningful because other companies will say, well, we're not going to be candid. We're going to provide a safe space where you're never going to be challenged. And we're going to provide safety, but we're not going to, we're going to guarantee you lifetime employment. Actually, Netflix says this is not the case. We're only going to keep the very, very best people. And so this tells us something useful because it rules out the opposite, which is an approach to employees based on safety. This is uncomfortable. This is controversial because there might be others who are saying, well, as a company, no, you should keep everybody and provide an environment of safety. Now, let me get to a different topic, which is, yes, we've defined our purpose, but then how do we report it? And in particular, how do we use ESG metrics? So that is one of the buzzwords of the time. Companies are being asked to report their ESG metrics to prove that they are walking the walk, not just talking the talk. But just like I have a contrarian approach to ESG and to purpose, I have a contrarian approach to ESG metrics. I think what we should do is actually not think about things as ESG metrics. So why do I take this controversial attitude? Because when we think about the ESG metrics that companies are asked to report, such as water usage, carbon emissions, and so forth, those are relevant, like companies should not contribute towards water scarcity or climate change, but those metrics are based on do no harm. Right, so if we think about Vodaphone launching M-Pesa, that probably increased its carbon footprint a little bit, but it created so much value to society, it would be crazy just to report on these harm metrics and ignore the amount of good that an innovation creates for society. And also, those metrics are generic. Why? Everybody says ESG metrics should be comparable because then we are able to put all companies on the same footing. But where does this demand for comparability come from? It comes from two sources. Number one is standard setters. And standard setters want as many people as possible to apply their standards. They claim victory by saying thousands of companies are reporting according to my standard. And where else might this demand come from? It could be from investors who have no knowledge about ESG. But if they need to show that they're doing ESG, they can compare numbers. Right? So it's really easy to compare the number of the amount of carbon that one company produces versus another and say the lower emitter is better. Just like if I had no knowledge about music, how would I say who was the best rock band? I could just look at their sales. And we know this is absurd because some of the best rock bands which are critically acclaimed, they might not be the most commercially successful. So what I'm trying to highlight here is that we don't want to always focus on metrics which are about harm and which are about comparability. Because, as I stressed earlier, a purpose should be unique to a company. And if it's unique, it should be based on comparative advantage and materiality, and therefore it should not be comparable. One company's purpose can be quite different to another. And indeed, if we forget about ESG metrics, we might remember 30 years ago, there was the launch of a really powerful idea, the balanced scorecard. And what this highlighted is to measure the performance of a company, we need to have a balance of not just financial measures, but non-financial metrics. Key performance indicators like employee retention, customer attrition, net promoter score, patent generation, and all of those things are clearly related to positive value creation, not just doing no harm, and they're clearly related to the business. These are things that are material and drive business success. Right? You can think about a key performance indicator as a leading indicator, and the leading indicator has to lead to something. These are things which are material to the business. But now when we think about some ESG metrics imposed by some external standard setting bodies, those are things which might not be material to a business. It might be water reduction targets, maybe for a financial services company. And maybe in financial services, the most material issues might be customer trust. We don't want to be in a Wells Fargo fake bank account. So what I think companies should think about is, given your purpose, what do you think are the most relevant business key performance indicators that track your delivery of that purpose? And let me just give you a few examples to just exemplify what I have in mind. So let me go back to Olam. That was the agribusiness I referred to earlier. And I said for them, a huge part of their purpose is sustainable supply chains. And so what they will measure is the number of smallholder farmers that participate in their sustainability programs to disseminate best practices in sustainable farming. What about electronic arms? Well, nearly every company reports their gender diversity in the workforce, but EA recognizes we have a big gender diversity issue with our customer base, because gaming is something which is historically very male dominated. So they're looking at the percentage of female customers. If our purpose is to inspire the world to play, the world is not just men, the world is both genders. And so this is why they're having this as part of their metrics. Let me end with this section with my bank, which is China's first digital bank. That measures the number of small and micro enterprises that receive a loan and how many of them had never received a loan from any other bank before. So why? If their purpose as a bank is the empowerment that financial services provides to allow entrepreneurs to set up businesses, then they need to make sure that they are providing some new financing, which is incremental, that businesses could not have otherwise got. And so there might be many banks that don't even track that. And even if you track it, you'd see this as a negative. But if this was a company that had never got a loan before, then maybe there's some creditworthiness issue with them. But instead, they're seeing this as a positive. Okay, so my final section will be on then how to manage purpose in terms of your relationships with your stakeholders. So if you have a pie splitting mindset, you want to maximize the stake that you give to investors in the form of profits. And you do this by squeezing as many stakeholders as possible. But the pie growing mindset is, how do we view stakeholders as partners and create shared value? Now, there's obviously many stakeholders I could talk about: employees, the environment, customers, taxpayers, communities, and so on. Let me just focus on employees, because let me go deep rather than be spread too thinly. And obviously the ideas that you'll have from here, you can apply then to the other stakeholders. So what is the traditional view of employees? They were just like any other input, just like raw materials. And with raw materials, your goal is to squeeze as much out of them as possible. Buy raw materials as cheaply as you can and use all of them up. You don't want to just have some wasted raw material. And this is what people thought about their workers. Like, pay them as little as possible and squeeze every ounce of effort from them. And indeed, about 100 years ago, one of the most influential management practices was invented, called scientific management. And this was based on the idea that workers were, number one, lazy, so you had to whip them into shape, and number two, unintelligent, so you had to tell them what to do. And so what Frederick Taylor said, who wrote about scientific management, he talked about a man who was handling pig iron, and he said this person is so stupid and so phlegmatic that he resembles in his mental makeup the ox. He is so stupid that the word percentage has no meaning to him, and so he must be trained by a man more intelligent than himself. Now, we have a different view of workers, which is that employees are not intrinsically lazy, they're intrinsically motivated. Left to their own devices, they will not just shirk, but they will have the freedom to create value in ways that you could never prescribe. And they're also intelligent, which is, you don't need to tell them exactly what to do. They might figure out the best way to do things. And this is often known as the contrast between theory X, where the X is a person refusing to work, and theory Y, where you have an employee who is cheering the opportunity to work and contribute. And so when we think about the shift from employees as a cost to be minimized as to be controlled, and instead a partner in the organization who cheers the opportunity to contribute, that leads to 3 shifts in terms of attitudes. So the first is what I call the attitude of empowerment. So what traditional management tries to highlight is to try to reduce the possibility of shirking through supervising your employees, through micromanagement. And also you want to prevent mistakes. So if you're supervising people, right, then they will not make errors. But the errors that they focus on are what I call errors of commission, doing things incorrectly. Whereas for me, what is more important is errors of omission. If you fail to create value, then that can lead to huge losses for society. What if Vodaphone had never had the courage to launch M-Pesa? Then hundreds of thousands of households would be worse off. But there would have been no backlash because nobody notices the mistakes that you make by not doing something. Instead, they only penalize you for the mistakes for doing things. And the traditional approach to management rules out the errors of commission, but by stifling employees and stopping them innovating, you're going to have a lot of errors of omission. And so, well, how do you change that? Well, as it says in the title, it's through empowerment. So in Japan, they had what was known as the Anden system, where previously, on an assembly line, only a shop foreman could stop the line because only they were qualified enough to notice a defect. Whereas with the Anden system, they trusted employees to notice defects and to stop the line themselves. And why it's called Anden, that's the Japanese word for lantern. And then a lantern would come up and that would highlight there would be a fault in the process. And so people would rally around and try to fix it. Google famously had 20% time where employees would spend 1 day a week just exploring whatever they wanted to do, rather than just having to follow pre-specified goals. And that led to some transformative innovations like Google Maps, which have a huge effect on us today. It's also important to tolerate errors of commission. But if we try something new and it leads to failure, then that's not something to be chastised or punished. Indeed, Intuit and Tata, they give awards for ideas that ultimately failed, but where the learnings were valuable. The second approach, in terms of a changing attitude to employees as partners, is what I call the attitude of investment. So if your employees are your partners, your colleagues, you want to invest in them. Now, there is a Nobel Prize winning economic theory which says you should never invest in your employees. Why? Because if you do that, if employees become more skilled, then they can get a higher wage elsewhere. And so even though they're more productive, you have to pay them more because they're more productive than they might be. But that thinks about things on an economic cost-benefit analysis. Let's only train workers if we ourselves as the company can get a return by being able to keep paying them at the same lower wage, even though they're no more productive. And importantly, why does this change in attitude come about? It's recognizing that some ways in which you train employees might not actually cost you money. So these are things which don't require you to do a cost-benefit analysis. For example, giving employees the chance to step up by allowing them to present in meetings, that's something which has a huge effect on their future human capital and their development. Mentorship, so some of you will know the book 1 Minute Manager, where if you just take 1 minute to praise employees or to give them 1 minute of reprimand or constructive advice, that can have a huge financial benefit later on. Why? By improving their human capital. And finally, when you think about investment, this is not just investment in skills, but also investment in well-being and mental wellness. And indeed, there's studies finding that if you spend $1 on well-being programs, that's linked to a significant fall in medical costs and also absenteeism costs. And when we think about investment, investment does not just mean increasing the benefits to employees through training or wellness programs, but reducing the costs to them, and in particular, getting rid of what I call the attitude of free disposal. So sometimes, particularly in my former career, which was investment banking, bosses would give workers tasks to do without even thinking that this is going to cause the junior person to have to work the entire night. Sometimes I was asked to do analyses just in case it came up in a meeting. And even if there was only a 1% probability of this coming up in the meeting, the boss would still ask me to do it. Why? Because they would not themselves need to bear the cost of the analysis. But a boss who clearly cares about investing in their workers will care about his or her well-being and not just automatically give you work to do without thinking about what is the mental cost to the worker of having to work the entire evening to do this analysis. And the final thing that I'm going to share is the attitude of reward. Is that I've talked so far about growing the pie, but also we do care about the split of the pie, is that if the pie grows, then anybody who's contributed to this should share in the benefits. And so we can do this with our colleagues in two ways. The first is financial ownership. So I'm a big proponent of employee share schemes, where if employees own a share in the business, I think this is very powerful. Why? Because this gives them greater incentives to create value if they know that they're partners of the organization who share in the benefits. And in addition to incentives, it's just fair to share the fruits of value creation more widely. But again, what I'm trying to stress in all of these ideas is that a lot of these things don't require financial expenditure. Instead, they are attitudinal shifts. And this could be not just financial ownership by giving shares in the business, but task ownership. So I remember there were times when I would write up a presentation at Morgan Stanley, and sometimes I would write the executive summary. And that was often the prerogative of the senior banker. And when I gave this to my senior banker, I'm sure he or she could have improved on it. But they realized maybe what's even more important is for us not to change this. If we think Alex has got this 90% correct, actually to give him full jurisdiction over this executive summary is going to be so much more important for his development than me micromanaging it and adding another 10%. And so sometimes if we are able to delegate some things, even senior banker things, like how to write the executive summary, then that is something which can have a huge effect on the context. Okay, so let me just end by saying, well, why did I choose to write this book, Grow the Pie? And why I'm so grateful to the Enterprise Engagement Alliance for putting this as part of the curriculum is I think for far too long, people have thought about purpose as just having a moral and ethical case. It's nice to have, but if you're a small company who thinks about survival, it's not practical. And if you're a large company, but there's a pandemic or a downturn, again, you can't afford to do it. But what I've highlighted is that purpose is something with a business and financial case. It leads to profits rather than being at the expense of profits. And also purpose does involve being focused and targeted on the material issues that you have comparative advantage in solving. And so that is something that we can then pursue at relatively little financial cost to ourselves. As a purposeful company, you don't need to be all things to all people. It is not your responsibility to solve all 17 sustainable development goals, but to be more realistic and focus on the 3 or 4 that you can really move the needle. And this allows purpose to be pursued in a way which is consistent with profits and also is consistent with difficult times and the challenges that you might face in a downturn or as a small business. Thank you very much for the attention, and I really appreciate your interest in my work.
Alex, I have to tell you, I am almost floored by your presentation today, and I'll tell you why. First off, it is exactly why we included your book as a core reading and why every member who joins the EA from now on receives your book. The essential, and I want to get a few more questions from you before we end, but at the top of the hour, but I just wanted to say your definition of purpose and the growing the pie mentality and aligning organizational activities toward things that benefit the organization and society at the same time. The Vodaphone idea is terrific, but even look at Microsoft or companies like Salesforce that enable thousands of entrepreneurs to create businesses using their software. So Microsoft is enabling Salesforce, whatever we may think about that company, is enabling people to get rich with very little investment by creating a whole world around their technology that is empowering women and creating women engineers. So, but let me ask you quickly, coming from the finance world, you know, and I know, pardon me, you'll say what you think. I don't think companies have looked at people as an asset. They say it, but I don't believe they have. And I know you're not given to hyperbole and you're not given to generalizations, but do you see a general shift truly occurring, not just check off the box compliance, as you kind of noted, but a true recognition that people are an asset and we have to begin to rethink how we manage them the way we had to rethink managing quality back in the 1990s?
I do see a positive shift, Bruce, and I think one of the drivers of the shift, I think partly is the evidence, is the research, is that any hard-headed business leader will know that I need to treat my employees better because these are things which are material for the success of the business. So I do think this is where research and data is helpful. But also, if you think about the changing nature of the workplace, so the traditional way to manage employees was the command and control, carrot and stick. I can measure how many widgets you've produced, and I can pay you per widget. And so even if you're not motivated, you don't care about the business, you need to work because that's how you're going to be paid. Nowadays, well, what do we look for employees to do? These are often things that we cannot quantify. So if you can't quantify them, you can't reward them with the carrot and stick. You need to make sure that they're engaged with the organization and they're really bought into it. So this is why I think enterprise engagement is something which is so important now. And the last thing in terms of the changing nature of the workplace is now working from home, right? So when I was an analyst at Morgan Stanley, you often had the associate looking over your shoulder and making sure that you weren't slacking off. Now that effort is even more discretionary, I think this is where engagement is really, really critical, because unless you have engaged employees who are bought into the mission, then there might be many corners that they might be able to cut because they're not being supervised. Right now that we have loads of Zoom calls, how do you know that your employees are not just turning their camera off and doing something else during the call? You don't. But if you are talking on the call, that's something really interesting and engaging, then they will be on the call, even though they do have the option to do something else doing it.
So one of the things, again, watching the clock here on ESG, I found, first off, I follow all of your posts on LinkedIn, and I find all of your views refreshing because you're calling into question this general, everybody overreacts and everybody tries to check off the box rather than really focus on the organic purpose of something. So let me ask, so my take on purpose is, instead of just looking at these blank ratings, a more effective approach is to really look at an organization's purpose. So if I'm reading their human capital report or the corporate sustainability report, what is their organizational purpose? Then what are the things that they are doing to improve, to achieve that? And then the metrics that they use to measure their progress. Is that rather than trying to come up with a blanket, the check off the box metric, do you think a better approach is to really look at metrics that are related to an organization's purpose and the methodologies that they use to achieve them?
Absolutely. And I would also say that we shouldn't think about purpose or ESG as being divorced from any other general business assessment. So let's say you're an investor and you don't think about ESG, but you're thinking about what makes a company a great investment. There is no standardized metric to look at. Right, you've got quarterly earnings, but you've also got market share, you've got EBITDA margin, you've got loads of different things, and you've got lots of intangible factors. You're going to look at management competence, you might look at corporate culture and the like. And I think this is the same for purpose, is that there's never going to be one overarching market metric that you're going to compare. You're going to be looking at things within the context of the business. So there might be some companies for which EBITDA margin doesn't matter because you care more about sales growth and margins. Margins might come later. And other businesses which are more mature where actually margins do matter more than sales growth. And similarly, for when we now think about purpose rather than just financials, there are some companies for which employee engagement is really important than in others. In others, you might think actually fair tax is an issue or carbon emissions might be an issue. But we want to think, well, what are the most relevant metrics for a particular business? And this is not going to be generic.
Well, Alex, in conclusion, you fulfilled exactly what we had requested for this. I asked you, said, don't just please, Alex, talk about the why, please talk about the how. And, I have to tell you, from a CEO or a CFO standpoint, this is really one of the best presentations I've heard, really about the how to really look at what's the difference between growing the pie, sharing the pie, and what is the real definition of purpose. So once again, Everybody, I recommend, whether or not you join the EEA, you go out and buy Grow the Pie. It's a terrific book. It'll always be on my bookshelf. And thanks again, Alex, for your time today and for everything you're doing to advance better business.
Well, thanks very much, Bruce, and thank you for all you're doing at the Alliance. It's a great pleasure to partner with you yet again.
Well, thank you so much.